Hi, my name is Diane Post. I am the legal director for the Secular Coalition for Arizona. And I am here today because Jeannie could not be here, so I'm taking her place in these weekly seminars. So today, our speaker is going to be Mia Bloom. She is an international security fellow at New America and professor of communication and Middle East studies at Georgia State University in Atlanta. Bloom is one of the world's leading experts on violence and extremism and conducts research in Europe, the Middle East, and South Asia. She's the author of 6 books and over 80 articles on violent extremism. Her next book, Veiled Threats, Women in Jihad, is expected in 2023. As usual, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A or the chat, and we will try to get to them when she's finished with her main presentation. Okay, Mia, take it away.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor. And as I've mentioned, I have very strong ties with Arizona, in particular with Arizona State University, which hosts a lot of the New America faculty, and with the McCain Institute. I have many friends there where we work on countering violent extremism and also trying just to make this a better and safer world. I actually have a presentation that I wanted to share with everyone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share it. Give me a second as I go to presentation mode. And I prepared something special for the group just to talk about on the subject of sort of socio-political movements and Q-Anon. And so this is relative and related to the book that I published last year, which was on Q-Anon. It's called Pastels and Pedophiles, Inside the Mind of Qanon. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Some of the stuff was in the book, as well as some of the newer research. And I'm actually going to bring it up to date, as in sort of what's going on right now. So let me just, as it was very kind of the introduction, but I have to always do this disclaimer because my research is funded by the Department of Defense and the US government. I have to let you know ahead of time that any mistakes are my own. I don't represent the US government, the Department of Defense, the Office of the Navy, or the Office of Naval Research, although they have been very, very generous and kind to me in terms of supporting my research for 13 years. But the other thing that's nice for you to know is that if there are questions in the audience that are related to some of the other research I do, women in jihad or child suicide bombers, or even insider threats within the US military, I can answer any of those questions during the Q&A. You're not going to be limited to just what you hear today. Here are the books. We don't have a cover yet for Veiled Threats, but as you can see, there's a theme to my books. They're all about either violence or terrorism. And I do like to have a little play on words with the titles. So for example, Dying to Kill, because they kill when they die, but they're also very eager. And then Small Arms, which was on children, because also their hands were small. So you will notice a certain amount of tongue-in-cheek in the titles. All right, so for anyone who doesn't know what QAnon is, very briefly, it's this baseless conspiracy theory that emerges in October of 2017 on sort of the underbelly of the internet and the chans. And major claim is that there is an elite group of Democrats, but also some notable Republicans, including the McCains. So there is an Arizona link that have been engaged in child trafficking and pedophilia, and that they torture the children and drink their blood. So that this cabal, or as my Congresswoman in North Georgia, Marjorie Taylor Greene, calls it, a cable, have been ruling the world and manipulating world events since time immemorial, very much sort of like the puppet master. Now, QAnon has gone from being this fringe conspiracy theory on the chans, 4chan, and then 8chan, and 8chan becomes 8kun, and then it jumped platforms to go to things like Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. So in other words, it starts with this very limited internet-based audience, and now it has been embraced by Republican leadership, by members of Congress, and adopted by many evangelical Christians. QAnon, basically, if you look at the basic tropes and the myths of QAnon, what you see is a lot of anti-Semitism which was, it's reproducing what was in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, or what was imported to the United States in World War I by Henry Ford, called the International Jew. And just for people who are unfamiliar with the protocols have been translated into 85 different languages, and it has sort of the worst tropes about a Jewish conspiracy to control the media, control the banks. It's been extended more recently to things like control Hollywood, control social media. But what we know about the protocols is it was a counterfeit pamphlet that the Russian secret police created in 1903. So it's not even a real pamphlet, and it's been known to be a fake pamphlet for a number of years. Nevertheless, it still is one of the sort of best-selling books ever published. And it's published, as I mentioned, in 85 different languages. Now, when we look at QAnon candidates that were in the primaries in 2020, we actually see that the three, and I would add Arizona as being one of the top 5 states that had these primary candidates. We had Florida, Texas, California, but Arizona is sort of in that next category of popularity. And among at the time, there was something like 97 different QAnon supporting candidates. 24 went on to the November election, of which only 2 won, and the 2 that won in 2020 have been reelected in 2022. This includes Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia and Lauren Boebert in Colorado. Now, when we look at the Christian aspect of it, one of the things is that we see that there's a fascination with conspiracies that is at the heart of white evangelical Christianity, and it's associated with an obsession about the end of time prophecy. And of course, part of this is when we try to understand why are evangelicals disproportionately more vulnerable to these conspiracy theories, part of it has to do with, as people are confronted with rapidly changing socio-political contexts, this end of time apocalypticism and messianism, it's been infusing evangelical politics and culture. What this means is that people who are feeling discombobulated become more vulnerable to conspiracy theories, and they find them to offer some sort of succor and make them feel better. And I'm going to explain the psychological dimension of that at the end of today's talk. Part of it is that many evangelicals and Christians were caught up in this QAnon conspiracy ideology that moved them from the pews to the Capitol on January 6, 2021. And so we saw a lot of Christian churches busing their constituents and their members to DC to participate, as well as participating in Stop the Steal and other kinds of demonstrations where QAnon has had its imprimatur. And I want to just mention for a second that this form of like this recurring dynamic that is driving white evangelical nationalism shows that, evangelicism in some extent has been dying off. It's not, the next generation is not upholding the same level of religiosity as their parents. We are seeing a growing either, if not atheism, then agnosticism. And what QAnon and many of these conspiracies do is they almost reanimate evangelical belief the way, you would reanimate a zombie in a horror movie. Now, so what are the claims, again, just to highlight and amplify what they're saying? They're saying that Democrats, Hollywood celebrities, and members of the royal family, for example, the Windsors, are trafficking children and drinking their blood, that the former president, Donald Trump, had a secret plan to bring the group to justice. And part of this was wrapped up in a campaign and a hashtag campaign in the summer of 2020 called Save the Children. And I'll talk about that a bit more. But also the QAnon beliefs spiked in 2020, plateaued, I think, as a result of the January 6th events, and they've been resurging in 2022. Some of the reasons for the resurgence have to do with during the campaign, many of you may have seen in places like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, Donald Trump would be playing the QAnon song, which is Mirrors. It's Where We Go One, We Go All. But also on Post Social or Truth Social before he was brought back to Twitter, he was identifying himself as Q+, which is what they call him in their ideology. And he was I think the term that they use is retruthing, what we call reposting and sharing QAnon memes. And again, all of this talk about the coming storm and how, you know, there is this evil that people are facing. And so people are making a choice between not just two different interpretations of politics, but good and evil. And so there's no compromise with evil. The other thing that's really important to understand is you cannot understand the spread of QAnon among evangelicals without understanding its role in the pandemic, in the sense that because of the lockdowns and because people were spending so much more time online and isolated in their homes, that there's this really turbulent mix of loneliness, isolationism, and the susceptibility to conspiracy theories, as well as the fact that for some people, a once in a 100-year pandemic might have looked like it was bringing the end of times prophecies to reality. Now, when you look at QAnon, I mentioned it started in October 2017, you can see that its popularity was relatively flat up until March 2020, and we have a 600% increase on Facebook of QAnon content that is shared and posted and consumed. But it's also very important to make the case that lots of people who share or consume content never do anything. So it's very important that we make the distinction between people who are either believing in QAnon and those people who are most dangerous. Now, according to some of the surveys that have been done by American Enterprises Institute, which is a conservative think tank in DC, as well as the Institute for the Study of Religion, about 1 in 5 Americans agree with the 3 core tenets of QAnon, that there is a storm coming that will sweep away elites and power and restore rightful leaders. And again, they don't define what they mean by rightful leaders, that the government, media, and financial worlds in the US are controlled by a group of Satan-worshiping pedophiles who run a global sex trafficking operation. And that's, you know, a little less than a quarter, it's about 18%. And that because things have gotten so far off track, real or true American patriots will have to resort to violence to save our country. That's the 18% that I think is most concerning to people like the Department of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, or to Merrick Garland, or even the head of the FBI, Christopher Wray. Now, the pervasiveness of QAnon, this was, remember, January 2021, right after the attempt to overturn the 2020 election. What we see is that about 29% of people who agreed with the statement that Donald Trump has been secretly fighting a group of child sex traffickers that include Democrats and Hollywood elites, 6% of the people that agreed with the statement also self-identified as Democrats. So while we do acknowledge that QAnon is bipartisan, it's not equally balanced between Republicans and Democrats. It is more Republican than it is Democrat, but it's extremely evangelical. Because when you look at the groups that most believe in this, you're either looking at white evangelical Protestants, or you are also potentially looking at Hispanic Protestants. And this is important to understand because it has filtered into many of the churches. And what many of the evangelical pastors are finding, that even if they themselves don't subscribe to some of the most absurd elements of this conspiracy theory, it's very difficult for them to preach against it. Now, during the pandemic, many of these pastors would say, we get these parishioners once a week for maybe an hour or two, whereas the internet and social media is getting them for 10 to 12 hours a day. So part of it is that there's an imbalance between how much content is available online, but also there was, to a certain extent, people lacked the community when, because of the pandemic and stay-at-home requirements, as well as, you know, there were some fairly strict measures in churches because of social distancing. People lacked the community that they needed, and what they were finding in a community was an online community that was disseminating disinformation and misinformation. And again, when you break it down, You have QAnon believers, as I mentioned, white evangelical Protestants at the lead. You even have Mormons, and to a lesser extent, Catholics. The smallest group, believe it or not, is going to be Jewish. We didn't include, for example, on here for PRRI, Muslims, which barely believe this at all, which is an interesting finding. When I show you later on the global spread, you're going to see that there is a very obvious lack of QAnon belief in parts of the Middle East, which is an interesting finding of our research. Now, as I mentioned, Christopher Wray, as early as 2019, was saying that QAnon had the potential to be a domestic terror threat. This was reiterated in 2021 by Merrick Garland and by Alejandro Mayorkas, worried that the fact that none of their predictions were coming true, or the increasing pressure on the former President Donald Trump, would actually lead QAnon individuals to violence, along what we saw last week in Germany. For those of you who were not following the news, last week there was an attempted coup, and the German police arrested 25 German, many of whom were German military veterans from elite forces. There was even some members of German nobility who were arrested that they had been planning a coup to overturn the government. This group was called the Reichsbürger, and they're sort of the equivalent of the sovereign citizen movement in Germany, that they don't believe that the German government is legitimate. But many of their members had been radicalized online by this QAnon content. Now, it's very important that, as I mentioned earlier, that with the potential of millions of people believing to a certain extent that statement that there is a cabal of elites that are trafficking in children and raping them and drinking their blood, and you know, people might believe in some of it, not all of it, but there's really important that we understand the overlap between QAnon beliefs and anti-mask, people who are anti-vaccine, people who are anti-5G, or people who were supporting things like the open protests during the lockdowns, as well as Stop the Steal in the aftermath of the 2020 elections. So we're seeing a lot of QAnon uptick among right-wing extremists. And so here's, for example, of the Gadsden flag, which is usually "Don't tread on me," but instead the snake is curled in the form of a Q, and it's using the QAnon, I guess, saying that they've popularized, "Where we go one, we go all." So as people are promoting conspiracy theories and misinformation, what our research has found is that people tend to believe not just in one conspiracy theory, but they tend to accumulate them. It's sort of like a bag of chips. You don't just have one. If you believe in QAnon, it's also very likely you believe in other conspiracies, that 9/11 was an inside job, or that the moon landing was fake, or there's numbers of other conspiracies that we'll talk about before we end today's talk and we start the Q&A. Now, on January 6, 2021, we know that many QAnon supporters stormed the US Capitol, and this is where we see the intersection of conspiracy, racism, QAnon, and what we call, in quotes, angry Christians, people who have been whipped up to engage. And here you have another resident of Arizona, although I think he's in jail now, but Jake Angeli, who's known as the QAnon shaman, who's really hard to miss in a crowd, given the face paint and the body tattoos and the horns. So he's sort of the most visually identifiable member of QAnon. But when you look closely at Mr. Angeli, I think this is where you get the sense of what I'm talking about when I mention something called intersectionality, that people are more than one thing at the same time. So we know that he's the QAnon shaman. We see from, you know, his involvement in Arizona politics, as well as his presence at the Capitol. But when you look at his body tattoos, you've got the Tree of Life, you've got Thor's hammer. These are tattoos that have been adopted by the far right extremists in order to identify with either the Patriot movement or you know, sort of the degrees of neo-Nazi belief, white racism, this great replacement theory that maybe some of you have heard about. And so you have literally within Jake Angeli somebody who believes in QAnon, but someone who also subscribes to these far racist right beliefs. The other thing that was very important, I mentioned early on, that QAnon has been pushing this idea that they needed to save the children. And so I pulled out from the QAnon platforms that they've disseminated their propaganda. You see that over and over again, there's an image of, children are in danger. And, some of it was interesting because, of course, they talk a lot about trafficking. And I'm going to say this right now, child trafficking is bad. I'm opposed to child trafficking. And, the statistics we have on child trafficking, which are loose statistics coming from various NGOs, as many as, let's say, 300,000 children a year are trafficked. But the vast majority of these children are coming from the global South. They do not look like the children that are in QAnon propaganda, including, you guys are thinking to yourself, is that Macaulay Culkin? And you'd be right, yes. So they'll put any pictures of children, including really old pictures of Hollywood celebrities. But the idea is that the children, white children, are the ones who are most in danger. Now, of course, there's also this theme in their propaganda, as you see, where the hand is over the child's mouth. And for the most part, across, and there were something like 20 different versions of this meme, where they're conveying to you that the children are being silenced or taken against their will. You see here, they're blaming the Catholic Church, or they're blaming, I don't know who the money is. Usually when these groups say the money, they're usually referring to globalists, or it's a code word for Jewish people. But in vast majority of these memes, and there were about 20 in total that we looked at, the child was white, but the hand was either black or brown. And I pulled out a few examples where the child wasn't white, but there is a racialized trope. And this has to do with post-Reconstruction era tropes about the quote unquote black brute. There were these images after the Civil War that the black man was coming for your white women. And this is something that was used in the summer of 2020 to target Republican women voters. And I will tell you that in Arizona, it has been very effective. It has been very effective at getting white Republican suburban women back to the Republican Party, because in 2018, either they didn't show up at the polls or they may have voted for someone else, which accounts for that little blue wave you saw in 2018. But this has really had an impact to revitalize the Republican movement. And that when you think about which were the QAnon supporting candidates that won, you have exactly Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene. So again, there is this targeting of white women deliberately to actually, at a very visceral level, convey that black and brown men are coming for your white children, despite the actual reality of trafficking, which is the vast majority of those 300,000 to 400,000 children a year that are trafficked are not white. The other issue that allows sort of evangelicals and other Christians to find QAnon resonant is the QAnon attitude towards Hollywood. They call, as you see, the O has been replaced with a Q, and the O's like eyes because they're being watched. I think that QAnon routinely refers to Hollywood as pedowood, with pedophilia. And here's where within every conspiracy theory, you have the tiniest kernel of truth. We know that there is a problem in Hollywood. There's been a casting couch for as long as Hollywood has existed. And we know from the Me Too movement that lots of women have been taken advantage of, abused, some have even been raped. And so the fact that there's that tiny kernel of truth allows the QAnon ideology to push the boundaries and say, well, if that's true, what else do we not know? And so what we've seen is within QAnon conspiracy circles, pushing this narrative that Walt Disney is trying to groom your children. So for example, what they'll do is they'll show you the signature that we all know from Walt Disney, and they'll show you the secret hidden 666. Or they'll show you that, you know, on a board behind, I guess that's Zach. I think that's, I forget the show. I think it's The Sweet Life with Zach and I forget the other brother, but they've circled the Illuminati, or they try to convey that there's eyes, you know, the Illuminati eye, or in some of the other ones, which I didn't pull out because they were a little bit silly, to show you that there are phalluses in Disney cartoons. So this idea that Disney is grooming your children and that Disney is bad for you. They've also, in recent, I guess the last year and a half, they've almost pivoted from Stop the Steal to being very anti-LGBT. So they will take pictures from pride parades. For example, here you have two guys with their adopted child. The child is kissing daddy, but they're trying to convey to you that it's something, you know, nefarious and that it's really pedophilia. Or they have this image where, you know, it's Oprah and Harvey Weinstein, and, you know, again, the white blonde girl who's most at risk. So these are images from their Save the Children campaign from the summer of 2020. And it's again to convey the danger lurking. But we've also seen it emerge on things like Fox News, where we've seen a lot of this moral panic from Tucker Carlson and other shows where, you know, they're talking about Mr. Potato Head, or what books have been pulled from Dr. Seuss, because the Dr. Seuss Corporation decided that the books were not selling. But of course, no, it's wokeism. And then my favorite is whether or not the green M&M is sexy. And I'm going to say, Tucker, if you find candy sexy, I think you have another problem. But we've also seen it to a certain extent on the left as well, that there's been this panic porn, that this idea that the internet is making young men violent and extremist. And again, this touches upon some of the other work I do on incels, which is the word for involuntary celibate. I can talk more in the Q&A. This I pulled was interesting during the Ketanji Brown Jackson hearings for SCOTUS, that QAnon was really pushing this idea of, you know, so you have Satan, you've got the pentagram and the candles on the floor, and there's a connection between being gay, sort of like, let's be gay now, communism, and critical race theory. And it sort of explains what Ted Cruz and some of the other questioning by Josh Hawley of Ketanji Brown Jackson that didn't make any sense unless you were familiar with what QAnon was saying on its platforms. And so for me, what was so fascinating is seeing on the encrypted platforms and in their chat rooms what they're talking about, and then seeing it being repeated by members of Congress or the Senate or on Fox News. And so there's almost this seamless, I was going to say bleeding, but spillover into the mainstream. And again, this idea that violence might be needed to save the country, again, we see it more among Republicans, but especially if they are watching either Fox News or One American News or Newsmax, you're going to have people who are more willing to suborn violence. And so again, these things tend to be connected. You are more likely to believe in QAnon if you believe the election is stolen, if you believe that the country is going in the wrong direction. And the reason is because certain groups are controlling the media, or certain groups are controlling the bank, or certain groups are against God. Now, when you look at the spread of QAnon, I mentioned that it's gone global. What you see is many countries, and top 5 countries happen to include the US, Canada, the UK, Germany, and then for 5th spot that usually changes and back and forth. But what you're seeing is a pretty red map of the world, with one area looking like it's almost inoculated, which is the Islamic Middle East. So we've been trying to figure out why that is. But one of the things we wondered in the book, in Pastels and Pedophiles, is, you know, I have many friends who are evangelicals, and we know it's a proselytizing religion. The question is, as evangelicals are spreading their Christianity, might it also lead to a contagion of QAnon ideology? And then more recently, we've had the possible spread of more QAnon via Twitter. So for example, Elon Musk, who now owns Twitter, on December 12th, posted follow the rabbit is follow the right rabbit. You saw the first slide in my presentation was like a computer generated rabbit, pixelated, right? So that was, again, Follow the White Rabbit was at the beginning of QAnon to explain that you, like Alice in Wonderland, you were about to go down the rabbit hole and discover a whole new world. But the other thing, as I mentioned, since QAnon tropes have become very anti-LGBT, the fact that Elon Musk accused the former head of Twitter safety, Yoel Roth, of being a pedophile, sort of is subsumed under this very comparable ideology. Now, let me just very quickly, I want to take the opportunity to explain what I meant by psychological vulnerabilities. And I'm speaking as someone who grew up, and when I was growing up, I will be honest with you, there were boys and girls. I mean, there was a section of the Blockbuster behind a curtain that was something else, but for the most part, it was, you know, biological duality, one or the other. And, you know, for people of a certain generation, the certain truths that they hold to be real, when these are being challenged, that's called an unfrozen social domain. And so when these beliefs are being challenged, people become a little bit, you know, discombobulated. So, for example, in science, we have a lot of people that don't trust science, whether it's about the environment or about the vaccine. We've had disgust and outrage by what's happened in religion with a lot of scandals that are occurring within the Catholic Church, but in other churches too, within Mormonism, within evangelicism, within the Orthodox Jewish community, so that it's not unique to just Catholicism, but the issue of boys being exploited by the Catholic Church has become, you know, almost a matter that people will joke about, but also gender roles. And so I think that we have a number of these unfrozen social domains that have affected our society. And as a result, it makes people more willing to believe in conspiracy theories because these conspiracy theories offer an alternative explanation. And people find a great deal of like, they feel better if there's something that explains it all. And what QAnon has done is, in many ways, it has become like this conspiracy singularity. It has pulled in conspiracies that far predated by 20 years. And so, for example, that there are lizard people on Earth, or that there are Jewish space lasers, or that the Earth is flat, or that you know, Tom Hanks and Hillary Clinton are involved in child trafficking. And what happens as a result of the belief in these conspiracy theories is that actually people feel better. They have fun, they start to experience pride, they feel a sense of belonging in this new online community. They might be feeling a collective outrage, but they feel fulfilled because they have figured out something that other people have not. So I wanted to end that with that point there. I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, I'm trying to figure out how to stop sharing. And so what happens is that we can understand why people have become more susceptible to QAnon, but also what are some of the underlying issues. It's about loneliness. It's about the uptick in mental illness as a result of the lockdowns and the pandemic. It's about the fact that we have a lot of questions, and we have platforms like Twitter now and other platforms that are disseminating disinformation and misinformation, including by the owner of Twitter, who has 131 million followers. So I look forward to your questions. I'm going to look at the chat, and I'm hoping that Diane can help also sort through some of this content for me, so I make sure that I can answer everyone's question.
Okay, one of the questions that we have in the chat is, why is QAnon and the conservative realm so obsessed with sex?
I mean, it's a great question, and we actually talk about that in the book. My co-author, Sofia Moskalenko, is actually a psychologist, and she had this really interesting idea, which you ordinarily don't have in an academic book, right? So we knew that everybody probably has someone in their friend or family network that believed in it. And so what are you going to do at Thanksgiving or Christmas, right? You're going to, not invite people because they have these beliefs? And we said, no. Don't alienate them or cut them off. Let them come. And we have FAQs, and of course, because I had the letter Q, we have a frequently asked questions section at the back of the book where we talk about why sex. And I think it's because at the most visceral level, when people talk about children being sexually exploited, it automatically appeals to parents at the most basic instinctive level. Like there, we hear stories about, the woman having almost superpowers to, get the child out of a burning vehicle, right? I think that there's something about the sex aspect that is both clickbait on the one hand, titillating, but also allows us to have that little kernel of truth because, let's be frank, there are children who are abused. And so if you believe that there is an abuse that is happening, it becomes maybe a little bit more believable that this abuse is more nefarious and systematic, that it's part of a greater plot.
Well, a follow-up question to that is how many of the people who are obsessed with pedophilia were sexually abused themselves as children?
And that's interesting because there are more people that believe in QAnon than themselves were sexually abused. And I previously, before Georgia State, I taught at Penn State. And all of a sudden in 2012, Penn State became very interested in pedophilia. And I'm being sarcastic, of course, because we all know what happened with the coach and the scandal. But as a result, I had a chance to spend a lot of time with researchers who work on pedophilia. And, not everybody who has been victimized necessarily that the outcomes are going to be mental illness or a willingness to believe in pedophilia. Many people get help and they are treated. So I think that it's like saying that many of the people who believe in QAnon might have been sexually harassed. There's far more women who've been sexually harassed than believe in QAnon. So I'm sure that there's a portion of people who are, if they have, unfortunately been victimized in their past, they might be more inclined to be empathetic, but I don't know if it automatically makes them more inclined to believe disinformation.
Another question is there some kind of a starting point of who is behind QAnon? Is it this guy from Arizona that ran for office, or when? Well, you did show us when it ramped up was when COVID hit, but is there a person behind it or a more amorphous structure or none at all?
Right, and I think you're talking about Watson.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is, when there were several documentaries, there was one by HBO, one by Vice News. And, it was interesting as Dr. Moskalenko and I were writing the book, we had a whole section about who was Q, because there were a number of different people. And what we came to the conclusion, without having to fly around the world in business class seats, by the way, was that based on the style of writing and the content, it looked like there were different cues at different times. And we actually even cited my favorite movie, Princess Bride, about the Dread Pirate Roberts. At some point, Wesley admits that he's the Dread Pirate Roberts. And Buttercup says, well, how is that possible? You've only been gone for, 2 years and he's been around all these years. And he says that the name is what counts. And so I think that whoever was posting as Q, these Q drops, these 4,900 and some Q drops, was probably changed over time, that it eventually was the Watsons, because the Watsons owned first 8chan and then it became 8kun. But I think by the time QAnon post the pandemic, sort of post that uptick of 600%, I think whoever it was, whether it was Ron Watson or not Ron Watson, it became almost irrelevant. Now, what the other thing is that we advocate in the book was follow the money, because a lot of these QAnon influencers, which we included General Michael Flynn, were making a fortune off of QAnon, either the merchandise or off of having their PayPal number or their Zelly number or Venmo. In other words, ways to compensate them for the work that they're doing. And so what I would always say is be very, I'm one of these people that says be very suspicious. If something looks like a grift, smells like a grift, walks like a grift, it's probably a grift. So I felt that QAnon was kind of a grift.
Yeah. Another comment was, I was surprised to see Hispanic Catholics had such a high QAnon percentage of 18. Comments on that?
I mean, this is one of the things that I find very disconcerting because, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, QAnon is kind of racist. You know, the stuff that they're pushing is very racist when they convey that Black and brown men are after your white children. And that's what's so surprising when you look at QAnon popularity in South and Latin America. You saw that, you know, it was pretty much covered in red. There are QAnon Facebook groups all over that part of the world, whether it's Latin America, South America, and Mexico. And it was one of the reasons we did the research, was hopefully to try to inoculate Latino and Hispanic voters to realize that this QAnon content was actually, like, at its base, super offensive. So I think that that accounts for the high numbers of Hispanic Catholics. There is a very large number of groups, QAnon sort of disseminating propaganda groups in Spanish. And so I have one of my grad students has been working on it, but Spanish is not one of the languages I speak. So I haven't been able to follow it as closely as we have looked at it in English and French and Russian, and believe it or not, even in Hebrew.
You mentioned the incels. Is there any religious connection with the incels, QAnon, and all the rest, or is it just anti-woman, or how do you tie that in?
You know, there's a deeply ingrained misogyny that connects, like, for me, who has studied before studying QAnon, as you saw from the cover of the books, I've studied a lot of terrorism and especially jihadi terrorism. It was one of the things that always struck me as so interesting, that the far right and the jihadis and the incels and QAnon all kind of hate the same groups. They hate Jewish people, they hate gay people, and they hate liberals. And so there, and at base, there's also a deep embedded misogyny, despite the fact that the Pastels part of the book talks about the women in QAnon. So I think that when we look at the incels, I'm going to say about incels what I said about QAnon. There are a lot more incels and people who believe in QAnon than people who would be considered dangerous. And so I think it's very important that we don't, with these wide brushstrokes, say that every incel is a potential terrorist. Although in Canada, a recent incel attack by a 17-year-old was treated as a terrorist incident. And there have been discussions about whether inceldom is a form of terrorism. But I do think it's important that we understand that one of the things that many of these radical groups all have in common is hatred of women. And one of the precursor events, let's say, to mass casualty or to school shootings, very often is violence against women. So while, again, there's more people that are engaging in domestic violence than are going to then shoot up a school or shoot up their workplace, I think we need to pay closer attention to people who engage in violence against women as maybe being that first stop along the way of radical extremism of whatever their beliefs.
Whichever way they're going to go.
Exactly.
I was reading a review of your book of Review of Dying to Kill and why IRA. Oh, yeah. And the question they asked was, why does the IRA not use suicide bombers? And I immediately leaped to my mind and said, they're Catholic. They're against suicide. I don't know if that's valid or anything else, but that was immediately.
Except if you think about Bobby Sands starving themselves to death, there were a lot of people who voluntarily stopped eating. And there were at least, I think when Bobby Sands died, there were another 10 others who died from starvation. And Maggie Thatcher at the time, even though Bobby Sands had been elected to Stormont, was, let them all die. So I think that it's not just the suicide. And in fact, I wrote a piece that in 1990, in April, there were a number of car bombings that, exploded the car at British checkpoints. There were 3 in the same day, but they actually held people hostage. They held the families hostage and they made other people go and blow up. So they themselves and blow up. There's this great story, and I won't do the accent because people find my Irish accent annoying, but there was this great story about after these car bombings in 1990 that, people went to the Falls Road, they went to the Sinn Féin office, and they said, stop making us look like those fanatics in the Middle East. In other words, they wanted to be like, we're not those kind of crazy. We are patriots. But, you did have people who were, willing to fast either, and they died as a result. I spoke during the research that I did for Bombshell, in which I went and I spoke to members of PIRA, Provisional IRA. I talked to one woman who at the age of 17 pretended to be pregnant, and she smuggled an explosive device into the Belfast airport. So a lot of the things that we've seen in the Middle East, actually the IRA were the first ones to do it, to hide a bomb inside a baby carriage or what they call a pram, and be willing to starve themselves to death. And so I don't think it's that itself as the Catholicism. I do think that they wanted to distinguish themselves, from Muslim suicide bombers that they perceived as being fanatics.
Right. Okay, another question in the chat. Is there overlap between the 2016 Cambridge Analytica social media election manipulation and the rising level of Q-inspired conspiratorial thinking?
I think the Cambridge Analytica issue, first of all, showed how social media could be manipulated. And I think if I was to find the thing that is in common between the two, it's the role of malign foreign actors like Russia and China. I think we cannot ignore Cambridge Analytica without understanding the role of the, what was it? The IRA was the Irish, so it was the Internet Research Agency, different IRA, Internet Research Agency in Russia that was, again, using and leveraging Cambridge Analytica. But it also shows us the way in which social media addiction could be used for political purposes. And, we call QAnon in the book sort of the weaponization of conspiracy theories. And that's the reason why we were able to get funded. I presented this well before January 6, 2021, because we were starting to see in various circles how what had happened in 2016 could again be duplicated in 2020. And we also know that the social media companies had the power with the algorithms to either to turn them on or turn them off. And when they turned them off, they were not as effective. And when they let them run loose, that the algorithms would bring someone to QAnon content within something like 10 different clicks. So you could go from 0 to Q in 10 miles or less. I want to make sure that one of the questions I saw at the very top from Susan Alexander, I want to make sure I answer that. Does Marjorie Taylor Greene believe in the stuff, I cleaned it up, the stuff she espouses? It's a really good question. I think that for some people, they are true believers. And I think some people have leveraged this because there's a financial benefit. With Marjorie Taylor Greene, I do believe that at base, she is anti-Semitic and homophobic, and there's a lot of groups that she doesn't like. And I think that the QAnon fits nicely within her worldview. But I also think that, the people who know better around her see that this is a beneficial position to take because they are able to exploit QAnon as a potential base of voters that are going to vote. They're tried and true Republicans that will vote for the candidate who is the most extreme. And so, like we had previously with the Tea Party, we now have a QAnon caucus within Congress. And the example that I would give would be Kevin McCarthy, who originally opposed Marjorie Taylor Greene. And in fact, Stephen Scalise donated money to her opponent when she first ran years ago in 2020. So I would say that, we have to understand that people are using QAnon believers instrumentally, and the term that the Russians use, useful idiots, unfortunately could be applied.
Yeah. One of the things you talked about was the concern that these groups are giving the defense organizations, as you mentioned. And one of my frustrations with that is that some of us have been telling the FBI and the DOD and other people for years about these groups, especially Arizona, the militia groups. Now we've got the constitutional sheriffs and all that kind of stuff. Some of us have been telling them for years, and they have ignored it and instead focused on women's rights groups and Black civil rights groups instead. Any thoughts about that?
I mean, one of the things that most disturbed me, because, I mentioned we have a project that's funded by the DoD on insider threats. And it came out, I guess, maybe 10 days ago that there are Republican congressmen who are, remember, when we come back from the Christmas break, the Republicans now are the majority in Congress. They want to make sure that DoD is not looking at insider threats in the US military at all. And so I think that that's a big problem, because it's very important to understand people who are militias who then believe in QAnon, or people who are far right and then believe in QAnon. They have the training to do, very nefarious things like what we saw in Germany. And now they have the QAnon belief system to push them over the edge. And the example that I would give, let's say from jihadism, within jihadi, Salafi belief, and again, not the vast majority of Muslims, but that small tranche of people who can do great damage. There is this belief that jihad is either a general responsibility or the individual responsibility. If it's your individual responsibility, it's not enough to support others doing it. It's incumbent upon you to step up and do something now. And then you have someone like Edgar Welch getting in their car in North Carolina and driving hundreds of miles to get to Ping Pong Comet Pizzeria. So this is where it gets dangerous. Now, if you have people who are following, General Michael Flynn and are in the military or are veterans, and we know that many of these far-right groups deliberately target veterans, and especially veterans who are experiencing mental health or PTSD issues. If they believe in QAnon, then we have a big problem. So this is where, it's unfortunately, it was never an issue post 9/11. We did not have a pro-jihadi caucus in Congress or among the Senate. And I'm very concerned moving forward that the issue of domestic terrorism has become a partisan issue. It should never be a partisan issue. We should all be opposed to terrorism, no matter who's perpetrating it. And it doesn't matter also if it's far left terrorism. We should oppose terrorism if it's the Animal Liberation Front, if it's Greenpeace. Whoever is perpetrating terrorism, we need to oppose terrorism and not ignore it when it's groups that we like and only oppose it when it's groups we dislike.
However, I would say that sometimes what they call terrorism on the left is sleeping in a tree or damaging a building, as opposed to terrorism on the right, which is killing a person. That's very different to me.
It is different. And I think that this came up a lot during the George Floyd protests. And I myself found on sort of the wrong side of history when I also took the position where I don't think damage to property is the same as damage to people. But then, members of the community explaining the only way they're going to get any airtime is if they're damaging property. In other words, there's been this benign neglect. George Floyd wasn't the first person of color to be killed by police, and unfortunately, he hasn't been the last. But in the absence of these massive demonstrations, which weren't just demonstrations, some of them led to either occupying parts of Seattle or burning down, parts of the neighborhood. That's what got the media, and that's what got the attention. And I personally don't find that to be useful and beneficial. And so that's where, again, as someone who studies terrorism, we understand that there's different definition of terrorism for different groups. So, for example, the military considers attacking members of the military to be terrorism, whereas the State Department considers terrorism to be attacks against civilians. That we have different interpretations and definitions of terrorism is nothing new. And I think that we can all oppose the idea that we're using violence in order to affect some sort of political change. That's a problem. But, hugging a tree, which again is different if you're trying to prevent loggers from cutting down forests, is very different than, forcing a plane down into a building. And I think looking at the tactics and also the targets are very important in making those distinctions. So what we should have, like we have with manslaughter or murder, we should have terrorism 1, 2, and 3 within the legal framework, so that if something is attacking physical property, maybe that's terror 3, where if something is a suicide bomb against people, that's terror 1. So I think that's there's space for improvement for the way that terrorism is litigated.
There's some questions just for our last 6 minutes here on Michael Flynn that are in the Q&A. With and they sort of all go together, so maybe we'll just try all three of them. With 18% of people surveyed believing violence is justifiable and necessary, and the pattern of lone wolf, politically and religiously motivated violence, is it reasonable to think things are going to get worse? If so, how do marginalized groups stay safe when they cannot rely on law enforcement or DOJ to protect them? And we are already seeing faith leaders and others saying LGBT people should be killed. What is the reasonable level of worry? And regarding Michael Flynn, how did he get so high in the military without any accountability?
Okay, well, so the first thing, which is kind of surprising, is that General Michael Flynn, he was always sort of very radical and extremely Islamophobic. But for the people who knew him years ago, he was actually a very brilliant strategist and was very effective in countering Islamic terrorism. The problem was he started to drink the Kool-Aid in believing that all Muslims were the problem, despite the fact that he should have known better, that it's again, it's an interpretation of an interpretation, very, very small tranche. Vast majority of Muslims do not believe in any of this, but that's what we have focused on. And so Michael Flynn, rose high in the military in part because of his abilities, but then of course he was fired by Barack Obama as the head of DIA, which is the Defense Intelligence Agency, for again his radical views, because he was over the top. And I think that his firing in conjunction with his pre-existing radical views kind of pushed him over the top. And so now he's become, in many ways, the poster child for, former military believing in QAnon. As far as the LGBT, I don't know if many people are aware, but Secretary Mayorkas issued a DHS memorandum about a week ago or 10 days ago, basically saying attacks against LGBTQ communities have to now be considered domestic terrorism as well. So I don't think the DOJ won't protect. I think that the DOJ will protect. I think that we are going to be dealing with a lot of challenges legally, because, and I say this as someone who works as an expert witness, and that I brief the FBI and I work with DOJ, that sometimes, it looks like terrorism, but it's going to be treated as a bias crime, or it looks like terrorism and the charges are going to be lesser, not because the DOJ isn't taking domestic terrorism seriously, but because the barriers for prosecution are lower when it's not terrorism. And also it can be done at the state level and not the federal level. So I think it's going to be very challenging, but especially what we have is a very partisan view of domestic terrorism. And I think that needs to change. And I don't know if constantly losing in the polls and the fact that you did not have the expected red wave, and so many of former President Trump's endorsed candidates lost, including in Arizona, like Kari Lake, I'm hoping that, especially with the young voters and with voters of color, the more people we can mobilize and get to the polls, the more the mainstream Republicans are going to have to disavow these crazy beliefs. You have Secretary Pete Buttigieg, every time he's on Fox News, there is no way to dislike Pete Buttigieg. I mean, he's just so darn charming and likable that I think that what will happen is increasingly, whether, and we saw this when it's in your own family, more people come out, the more people who are conservatives, who are evangelicals, are going to have to realize God doesn't make a mistake. And if everybody's been made in God's image, that includes the LGBT community as well.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. I found it fascinating, and we had a lot of great questions from the audience and a lot of good involvement. And I just want to thank all of you for being here and remind you that if you're not already a member of Secular Coalition of Arizona, you should be, because the price is going up next year. So join now and you'll get a special bargain. If you wait till January, sorry, you're going to have to pay more. So please join. And we have these every Friday. In addition, we have we have these things every Friday, and the legislature, as you know, is going to start up again in January. So keep alert. Thank you very much.
Is it a tax deduction?
Well, yeah, we're 501c3 and 4, so you can designate whether you want your money to go to the C3 or the C4.
There you go. So it's a tax deduction, everyone.
Thank you very much and goodbye.